Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the AAIM High Podcast, where we talk to Asian American inspirers in management. Today, I'm excited to have Phillip Kim, an entrepreneurial and venture capital expert, who has been leading the educational practice at Michelson Philanthropies since 2015. Phil has been instrumental in developing Michelson 20MM social impact investment platform, providing seed funding to mission-aligned education technology startups. In addition, he oversees early-stage programs at Carlin Asset Management. He has also actively contributes to entrepreneurship programs at prestigious universities like Wharton and MIT and Stanford. Thank you, Phil, for being with us today.
Thanks, Ben.
Maybe to start off, let's talk about your childhood and maybe any notable or moments that kind of shaped your childhood.
So I think I'm one of the few that's kind of born and raised in LA and still remains here. But I grew up, I guess, in a kind of interesting cultural bubble. You know, LA has such a rich Korean American community. But I grew up in a part of the city in sort of the 80s, 90s where I think a lot of my school experience, like K-12 experience, was pretty isolated as the only Korean for most of that time, and usually, you know, one of 2 to 3 Asians. And I was usually the only kind of token Asian in some of my friend groups. But I also went to, you know, Korean school on Saturdays and church with my mom often growing up. I definitely wanted to retain a lot of that Korean cultural identity and my Korean language definitely as well. But I always felt, you know, being a little bit like I was pulled in different directions there. And, you know, to a certain extent, when you don't quite fit, you're kind of an outsider everywhere and an imposter everywhere, right? And it definitely had moments of being confused of kind of that cultural identity and who I was based on my background. But, you know, as you grow up, I think you find a lot more kind of meaningful connection and a lot more pride in your cultural identity. And looking back, I think those experiences have really served me so well, just in terms of being adaptable and versatile, and really being kind of open to a lot more than if I had a more traditional or consistent experiences. So grateful for a lot of that background as well, especially in a city like LA.
Yeah. So you mentioned church and school and how it was kind of like a bubble. So how did you adapt and find your own identity?
Yeah. It's tough, I think. And really only like after you kind of go through it, do you have like that perspective looking back on those experiences. Yeah, I mean, I think being put into kind of the range of those different environments, I think a lot of folks at first are kind of, you know, embarrassed about the differences or, you know, that you're kind of an outlier in those different contexts. But I think what you start to realize as you kind of build confidence and more certainty in who you are is that, you know, you're bringing a pretty unique perspective. And I think adding a dimension to whatever environment you're in that kind of encourages you to really lean into, you know, your differences versus being embarrassed or standoffish for any of those differences.
Yeah. You mentioned your parents and your like Korean American identity. How did like their perspective on work and success influence you in your childhood growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a child of Asian immigrants thing to say, but I try not to lose sight of my parents' experiences. That certainly, you know, I think contributed to their work ethic and their values and everything that I think has shaped me in a lot of the best ways possible. But, you know, back in the 1950s, you know, my grandfather was in the Korean military. And so my mother actually spent part of her early years in a war prison. So when she was like 4 or 5, she was in a war prison, and my aunt, her younger sister, was actually born in that prison. And the story goes that, if she was a boy, they would have all been executed. Thankfully not. But then, decades later, both of my parents came to the U.S. with a couple $100, limited language skills, and they landed in Kansas and then Michigan. And I think for us, our generation, it's pretty impossible to kind of even imagine what that experience was like. And so when you anchor, your perspective to things like that relatively, I think it just makes you grateful for the opportunities they've created for you. And I think it gives you a good perspective, especially when, you're facing challenges in your day to day that, you should really keep things in perspective in that way. So it's really been, a motivating thing. And of course, wanting to make sure that you kind of do justice to the sacrifices and the work and everything that they put into giving, you the opportunity to, to have the careers that we all have and the type of work that we're able to do.
Yeah, definitely. So as we move from more of your childhood to later education and early career, of course, education plays a huge role in shaping one's career. Could you maybe walk us through your academic journey, maybe starting from high school, and what challenges did you face and overcome throughout that journey?
I mean, infinite, but I think the hardest thing for me was always kind of being a jack of all trades, master of none type of thing. I did pretty well across different subject areas, and through college, I really felt this need to keep the optionality. So I studied public policy and finance, but I completed the pre-med requirements and took the LSAT, and I just really couldn't decide on what to do. And I think ultimately, that just really creates confusion and sort of what they call analysis paralysis, right? And one thing that I really wish I had done earlier was really kind of make a decision and trim back some of that so that I could really focus and go deeper. But I do think in the end, having that kind of wide range of educational experiences and approaches and ways of thinking of problems, it definitely has served me well later in the career, especially, as I work on so many different types of projects and areas and have to engage in so many different industries and strategies in my various roles. But yeah, if I could give a piece of advice to my younger self, what would be to just kind of make a decision on some of those things, and life will be a lot easier for you.
Yeah. You said how you kind of did everything, but you couldn't pick one. How did you figure out kind of what you wanted to do? Did you experiment, or did you just kind of go with one and see where that led you?
It took a lot of experimentation, I think. But ultimately, actually, I think it's a piece of advice that my parents always gave me when I was younger. My mom was just, you really have to pick something that you love to do. And success follows so much more easily there, and you can be more successful in something that you just enjoy naturally. So, don't try and conform to whatever idea of success or whatever career you think is appropriate. You really should pursue something that makes you feel great and happy, and don't just go chasing the dollar in that sense.
Yeah. What was that thing for you that you really just enjoyed when you were studying, that you felt like you could just follow?
I've always really enjoyed and been fascinated by the systems that govern our society. So geopolitics and diplomacy and world shaping. And, even in like school, I always gravitated towards student government and those types of things. Because it just gives you a lot of perspective on communication and the mechanics of relationships and how, these large systems are created and how they operate. And now actually in my career, I still, spend about a quarter of my time working with public policy folks and governors and state legislators and federal agencies. So all of that actually does come in handy. I, of course, didn't know that at the time, but I think just that sort of larger perspective that, even if you're working with one investment fund or one founder of a startup, like they're part of a much larger kind of apparatus, and understanding the dynamics of how that whole world works is just a useful kind of macro perspective, even if you're making micro decisions on an investment deal or anything else.
Yeah. And as we move on in your career, what did that transition specifically look like from college to maybe where you are now?
Yeah. Actually, through most of college, I did think coming out that I'd do like a year or two in investment banking, just as kind of a foundation of a lot of those core skill sets that would be applicable throughout all of finance, venture capital included. But I actually worked, a year or more to kind of secure a good position at one of those banks. And I think just about 2 months in, I ended up quitting and leaving New York. And it was actually because I got a great piece of advice from someone who was kind of becoming a mentor for me there. But it was, look at the guy that did everything right, and did 2 decades in that path, and kind of decide if that's really the life that you want, and that's what would make you happy. And for me, like, the answer was such a clear no that, I took those kind of drastic steps to come back to LA and kind of start out in the startup world. So on the company side. And I think once you sort of get into the startup space and that early stage space, it's easy to be hooked pretty quickly because there's just so much excitement and so much uncertainty. And especially if you're somebody who naturally gravitates towards this, idea of building something, there's really nothing else like it.
Yeah.
But in that experience and working with founders, you really do also start to understand that the founder personality, at least like the personality of a successful founder, is a pretty singular one. You have to have a almost delusional belief, right, that your venture is going to be the one out of 100 that ultimately kind of makes it big. And I'm pretty risk tolerant and pretty adventurous in that sense, but that was a little bit much. But working with those founders, who I think are like the most exceptional category of people in the business world, is tough to replicate. And venture capital is sort of the next adjacent space where you can stay very close to those founders and those companies, be a part of building those ventures and taking it, from 0 to 1 or 1 to 100. But you do have the advantage of being able to build a portfolio of those ventures, right? So we've invested over the last 7-8 years, we've invested in 80 startup companies and have stood up 2 accelerator programs. And so having that ability to stay close to that like energy of the early stage startup space, but have a little bit more of like the stability and the bigger picture of a venture fund position was kind of a no-brainer for me. So that's kind of how I landed, I think, in this space.
Did you know that you wanted to do venture coming out, or like just those like experiments is what made you make that like transition from like switching out of the startup world into venture more?
Yeah, I mean, there was always kind of like a draw to venture. Like there was something really exciting about it, and a lore of being, involved in some of those companies that became those early unicorns, right? So the space always had like an appeal. There were so few positions in venture generally, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there was always a draw to VC, but never a clear picture that that's where I wanted to end up. I just knew that I loved being in like the early stage and startup ecosystems.
Yeah.
And really, I was fortunate to land at a larger kind of investment fund that had just a kernel of an interest in building a venture platform, and had the opportunity to sort of be part of the creation and standing up of the venture and investment practice, which is pretty non-traditional, I think. The more tried path is right to kind of work your ranks up, way up the ranks of kind of the analyst, associate, and in a traditional fund, regardless of size. But I just had such a unique opportunity to be part of kind of the creation of something like that. So yeah, I had to jump on it.
Yeah. As you were very involved in the startup space, in your own experiences, what was like one challenge or moment that you grew most from?
I guess really it was creating what is now Michelson Impact Ventures. So one of the hats that I wear is as managing director of Michelson Impact Ventures. And so for more context, it's MIV is a social change fund. And so we invest mission critical capital into purpose-driven startups that have the potential to improve conditions, improve the market across education, future of work, future of food, so like alternative proteins and things like that, and digital health. And we also focus on diverse founders. So nationally, the numbers are always around like 2% or something of VC across the country goes to underrepresented founders. And so 70% now of the companies in our 80 plus portfolio have a founder of color or a female founder. And so this whole kind of strategy, when we were building this out, not a lot of funds, not a lot of offices were explicitly doing this. And so it was a real kind of education process to get the rest of the organization and my primary funder backer to get comfortable with this strategy. And there's other regulatory implications and other things, but it really took years and like a trickle of direct investments here and there to get to a point where we could have steady allocations towards this. We could stand up the 2 accelerator programs I mentioned, which puts through cohorts of 6 or 7 companies and founders on an annual cadence, and building out the portfolio and constructing the strategy in that way. And it that took several years. So it was such a hard fought achievement.
Yeah.
And really, in terms of like just learning and personal growth, like one of the most satisfying experiences, and certainly, one of the things that I'll always feel good about achieving.
How did mentors help you through your career, guiding you and giving you advice that you could implement to try to be as successful as possible?
Yeah, I mean, one regret of mine is actually that I should have made much more use of like those opportunities and drawing from the wisdom of mentors. But really, I mean, it's helped me every step of the way. I don't think that any of the work that I've done or any kind of the achievements on the venture fund side or on the legislative work or on the foundation that I also oversee, like I don't think any of that would have been possible without great mentors, and not just mentors. I mean, really peers as well. I think one of the big lessons was just always to be humble enough to know that you can learn as much or more from the people, working alongside you versus the folks that are, a decade ahead or more in their careers. Like, you really do get so much from that kind of peer interaction and learning that I think in both dimensions, the mentorship piece and the peer learning, like you grow equally from both contexts. On the mentorship side, it does also, even in acting as a mentor, I think you do gain quite a bit as well. Here and there, informally, I work with a lot of Korean startups, for example, that are looking to get into the U.S. market, or with folks that are young and trying to get into the venture space. We have interns and others coming through. It's actually, especially in tech and especially in sort of areas and sectors where you need to stay close to the leading edge and more of the innovative thinking. Like, those younger mentees, I think, can often bring as much to those mentoring relationships, because you get so much added perspective and you understand the evolving way that this generation is thinking, and I think it definitely it enriches your perspective when making decisions on investments and other things as well.
To wrap up this segment on kind of your career, what has been like one of your recent projects you've been working on that has been fascinating?
Well, the Michelson Impact Ventures Fund continues to be, a top priority for me, and to see all of these companies now that, when we invested, they were at a $5 million valuation, and so early in their trajectory, product maybe not in market yet, like $0 in revenue, to see some of them now raise at $100 million valuations and start to become market or segment leaders is really satisfying, really encouraging, certainly, for us to continue to double down on the strategy and continue to build that out. The other piece, like, that I've been leaning more into recently is actually kind of on the the government and legislative side. So we do a lot to create and help support the passage of legislation and steer government funding and government investment. And it's really, one of the more recent lessons with all this work is that government sometimes just operates on like a different scale. And it seems like a heavy lift and an impossible lift until something happens, right? Like you get over that finish line. For years, we actually worked with Governor Newsom to try and get him to invest in this really like niche project that we had going in California. And I think it was like 3 or 4 years of conversations here and there. But it ended with him just recently, or a few years back, putting $115 million into the project that we had. So it was, it created this new momentum that, government is this sort of great lever in many of these instances, and encouraging to see that, with the right kind of strategic approach and work that you really can get government to move on some of these things. So the mix of this investment world and the bigger public funding world has been sort of a newer focus area and approach in my day-to-day work. And so now trying to understand like the confluence of those two spaces has been a really exciting new kind of frontier of work that we're doing.
Well, great. Thank you for talking about your career. And as we move on to the final part of advice and inspiration, my first question is, what advice would you give to young Asian Americans aspiring to enter up high business roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think setting a goal is a pretty obvious thing. But, a few years ago, I really started to be consistent about like writing them down. And it's such a simple thing, but there's something about just the tactile exercise of writing those goals down, and then the process of reading it and reprocessing it, and then setting out those immediate objectives that you need. I can't overstate the impact and help that's given me to just literally get the clarity of writing that, because I think we all have the goals that are in our minds and that we're working towards, but putting it on paper is such a simple thing, but it can have a pretty outsized impact, I think.
Yeah.
The other piece I'd say is just everything is so relationship driven, so just cultivate great relationships, and to your questions around mentorship and the peers, and just surround yourself with people that you respect and you emulate. I think a lot of people adhere to that idea that somebody is kind of the summation of the 3 or 4 people that they spend the most time with or that they're closest to. And I think that's really true. Like, the direction that you take and the way that you evolve is so much of that is determined by the people close to you that are influencing you in that way. And, again, always, just have that humility to learn from those folks whenever you can.
Yeah. For like your goal setting too, how is that a way that makes you stay motivated and focused?
Yeah, I think definitely it keeps you just sort of like logically locked in on what you're trying to achieve. And, in that vein, like, especially if you're engaging in spaces like venture capital, like it's inherently risky, right? Like you're not going to have everything pan out, and there are going to be some failures along the way, some small, some colossal, but I think having a logical reaction, not an emotional sort of reaction to any one of those setbacks, where you're really able to assess what went wrong and kind of grow, even incrementally grow from any of those failures, is I think it goes a long way to contributing to improvement over time.
And finally, what was the best piece of advice someone ever gave to you that really helped you?
I mean, I guess I'd go back to that piece that I shared from my mom, actually, is just pursue something that you really enjoy. Your likelihood of success in doing something like that, it just makes life so much better. But really, it lends itself to a higher probability of you being successful. And so I think too often we're unwilling to kind of take those larger risks and get into those non-traditional career areas. But I do think that you kind of have to lead with what makes you happy versus what you think is going to give you the biggest paycheck at the end of the day.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Phil, for being on the podcast today. Really appreciate it. It was very great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben.